David sat at the back of the classroom, staring at the glowing symbols on his holopad. The words blurred together, and his head hurt from trying to understand the complex formulas. The professor, a tall blue-skinned alien with 4 glowing eyes, continued explaining in a deep, humming voice. David tried to focus, but no matter how hard he studied, he always fell behind. This was Galactic Academy Prime, the most advanced learning institution in the universe. It was a place where the best and smartest students from hundreds of planets came to train. David was the only human here, and he was also the worst student in his class. David, the professor's voice snapped him out of his thoughts. Answer the question. David gulped. He hadn't even heard the question. The whole class turned to look at him. His classmates, all from different species, their eyes filled with amusement. He could hear the soft laughter of Saltor, a Uvian with silver skin and telekinetic abilities. Next to him, Zerka, a tall Ralvian with sharp features and a brilliant mind, smirked. I don't know, David admitted. Zaltor chuckled. Typical human. Slow as always. Zerka sighed. Why is he even here? This academy is for the best. He's just wasting space. The professor shook his head and turned away. Disappointing, as always. Try harder, David. David clenched his fists. He was trying. Harder than anyone knew. But nothing seemed to work. The academy's weakest. David wasn't just failing in academics. He was also terrible at combat training. The academy had a special battle simulation room where students trained against holographic enemies. Today's exercise was a speed and reflex test. The students had to dodge energy blasts from automated drones. It was a common drill, easy for most of the aliens. David stood in the arena, watching his classmates move with incredible speed. Salter barely had to move. His telekinesis stopped every blast before it even reached him. Zerka used her advanced brain to calculate the pattern of the attacks, dodging effortlessly. The others had their own special talents. Some could predict the future, others had natural armor, and some moved faster than light. Then it was David's turn. The moment the drones activated, they fired at him from all directions. He tried to dodge, but his movements were too slow. A blast hit his shoulder. Then another hit his leg. Within seconds, he was on the ground, the simulation shutting down in failure. Laughter filled the room. Pathetic, Xaltor muttered. He doesn't belong here, Zerka added. Humans are weak. They don't have enhanced reflexes, intelligence, or special abilities. He's just normal. David pushed himself up, his arms shaking. He hated this. He hated being the weakest. But no matter what he did, he couldn't keep up with them. A lonely struggle. After training, David sat alone in the cafeteria, staring at his untouched meal. It wasn't that he wasn't hungry. He just didn't have the energy to eat. Every day was the same. Failure after failure. Humiliation after humiliation. His only friend, a small robot assistant named Pip, hovered near him. David, your food will get cold, Pip said in a cheerful voice. David sighed. What's the point, Pip? No matter how hard I try, I'm always last. I don't have superpowers. I don't have genius-level intelligence. I don't belong here. Pip beeped softly. You're different, but that doesn't mean you're weak. David shook his head. Tell that to the rest of the academy. Across the cafeteria, he could hear other students talking about the upcoming survival trial. It was a test where students had to survive against real war drones in a combat arena. It was meant to push them to their limits. Everyone was excited. Everyone. Except David. If I can't even dodge training drones, how am I supposed to survive the real thing? He muttered. Pip's glowing blue eyes blinked. Maybe you just haven't found your true strength yet. David laughed bitterly. What strength? I don't have any. But deep inside, something told him Pip was right. He had to have something. He just hadn't found it yet. Little did he know, The survival trial would change everything. The academy was buzzing with excitement. The survival trial was the biggest test of the year, and only the best students could pass it. The challenge was simple: survive against real war drones in the combat arena. These drones were faster, stronger, and more dangerous than the training ones. They could analyze an opponent's fighting style and adapt to it. David stood at the edge of the arena, watching as the other students prepared. Zaltor flexed his fingers, his telekinetic energy glowing around him. Zerka adjusted her combat suit, her eyes scanning the battlefield with calculated precision. The other students, each with their own special abilities, were confident. David, however, felt like he was walking into his own defeat. "You look nervous," Zaltor said with a smirk. "Don't worry, human. It'll be over quickly for you." Zerka sighed. They should have given him a weaker challenge. This test is for real warriors. David ignored them, even though their words stung. He already knew he was the weakest. He didn't need them to remind him. The trial begins. A loud alarm rang across the arena. The survival trial had begun. The war drones flew into the battlefield, their metallic bodies glowing red. They scanned the students, calculating the best way to attack. Zaltor was the first to act. He raised his hand, and an invisible force stopped the nearest drone in midair. With a flick of his wrist, he crushed it effortlessly. Zerka moved like a shadow, dodging every attack before the drones could even lock onto her. She grabbed a fallen weapon, fired precise shots, and destroyed her enemies with perfect accuracy. The other students fought with equal skill. Some used speed, some used strength, some used pure strategy. Then came David's turn. A drone locked onto him and fired a bright energy blast. David jumped to the side, barely avoiding it. Another drone shot at him. This time, he wasn't fast enough. The blast hit his arm, sending him tumbling to the ground. The audience sighed. It was exactly what they expected. David groaned in pain. He could already hear the others laughing. He needed to get up. He needed to fight. But how? He had no superpowers, no advanced intelligence, no special gifts. He was just human. A second drone flew toward him, its weapon charging for another attack. David's heart pounded. His body moved on its own. He rolled to the side, dodging at the last second. He grabbed a fallen metal rod and swung it at the drone's head. Cracky! The impact sent the drone spinning backward. David didn't have time to think. His instincts took over. He ran, weaving between the drones, dodging their attacks by the smallest margins. His movements became faster, more unpredictable. He wasn't the strongest or the smartest, but he was learning. He was adapting. Something is different. From the observation room, the professors watched in shock. "Impossible," one of them muttered. David was the weakest student. How is he still in the fight? "He's changing," another professor said. "Look at his movements. He's not fighting like the others. He's reacting. He's learning mid-battle." Back in the arena, Zaltor and Zerka had also noticed. "This doesn't make sense," Zaltor said, frowning. He was supposed to lose. How is he surviving? Zerka narrowed her eyes. Humans aren't supposed to have powers, but maybe they don't need them. David, meanwhile, wasn't thinking about any of this. He was too focused on staying alive. His body felt light, his reflexes sharper than ever before. It was like his mind had unlocked a hidden ability. An ability that no one had noticed because it wasn't something you could see. It was adaptability. Unlike the aliens, who relied on their fixed powers, David was changing with every second. He wasn't stronger than the drones. He wasn't faster. But he was learning their patterns, adjusting his movements, and fighting better than before. And for the first time, he wasn't losing. The turning point. David stood in the center of the battlefield, breathing heavily. Around him, destroyed drones lay scattered. He looked at his hands, still gripping the metal rod. He had survived longer than anyone expected. The arena was silent. The audience, the professors, even his classmates, everyone stared at him in shock. David took a deep breath. Maybe he wasn't the weakest after all. Maybe he had something no one else did. And this was only the beginning. David stood in the middle of the battlefield, his chest rising and falling as he caught his breath. Around him, the remains of destroyed drones sparked and twitched. The silence in the arena was almost louder than the explosions had been. He had done it. He had survived. The other students stood frozen, their expressions ranging from shock to confusion. "How?" Zaltor whispered. His telekinetic energy flickered, a sign of his uncertainty. Zerka frowned, eyes locked on David. That shouldn't have been possible. David didn't care what they thought. His mind was still processing what had just happened. His arms and legs ached, his body screaming in exhaustion. He had never moved like that before. So fast, so precise. It was as if his instincts had taken control, showing him exactly how to move, how to react. And it had worked. But why now? Why had his true strength awakened at this moment? The professor's interest. High above the battlefield, in the observation room, the Academy's professors analyzed the footage. "This is unbelievable," one professor muttered. "He was the weakest student yesterday," another said. "Now he's fighting like a seasoned warrior." Professor Gerrel, the Academy's senior combat instructor, studied the holographic replay. Unlike the other professors, he wasn't surprised. "I've seen this before," he said slowly. The others turned to him. "Seen what?" "This ability," Gerrel continued. "It's something unique to humans. They don't have built-in advantages like other species. No telepathy, no enhanced speed, no natural armor." "Then how did he do this?" Gerrel's lips curled into a small smile. "Adaptability." The other professors exchanged glances. It was a simple word, but in battle, it meant everything. Zaltor's challenge. Down in the arena, the silence finally broke. Zaltor stepped forward, his silver eyes glowing. "You think that was impressive," he said, voice filled with mockery. "You just got lucky." David met his gaze, still catching his breath. "Lucky," he repeated. "Yes," Zaltor said, cracking his knuckles. "You dodged a few attacks, hit a few drones, and now you think you belong here. You're still the weakest among us." David didn't react. He had heard these insults before. But something was different now. Before, he had believed them. Now, he wasn't so sure. Zerka, standing beside Zaltor, crossed her arms. "If you're really so strong," she said, "then prove it." David narrowed his eyes. "How?" Zaltor grinned. "Fight me." The crowd gasped. A one-on-one battle. Against Zaltor. It was madness. Zaltor was one of the strongest students in the Academy, a master of telekinetic combat. He had never lost a fight. David knew that, but something inside him refused to back down. "Fine," he said. The students murmured among themselves. Some whispered that David was a fool. Others were curious. Could he really challenge one of the best? Only one way to find out. The duel begins. The battle arena was cleared. A circular combat ring was activated in the center. The energy walls rose up, trapping David and Zaltor inside. Professor Gerrel stepped forward. "This is an official duel," he announced. "The fight ends when one of you surrenders or is unable to continue." David took a deep breath. His muscles were still sore from the trial, but he pushed the pain aside. "Focus." Zaltor raised his hand. Instantly, an invisible force lifted David off the ground and slammed him against the wall. The crowd cheered. David gritted his teeth. He had expected this. Telekinesis was a powerful ability. Zaltor didn't even need to move to attack. David hit the ground hard. Think, think, think. He couldn't match Zaltor's power head-on. He had to adapt. Zaltor smirked. Is that all you've got? David pushed himself up. Not even close. The next attack came fast. Zaltor tried to lift him again. But this time, David moved first. He jumped sideways, rolling across the floor. The attack missed. Zaltor frowned. He flicked his wrist, sending another force wave toward David. But David was already moving, dodging at the last second. The audience gasped. Zerka's eyes widened. He's predicting the attacks. David wasn't stronger. He wasn't faster. But he was learning Zaltor's patterns. Every telekinetic strike had a delay, a slight movement in Zaltor's hand before the attack came. It was small, but David saw it. And he used it. He ran straight at Zaltor. Zaltor's eyes flashed with confidence. Fool. He lifted both hands, preparing to throw David into the air. But David wasn't there. At the last second, David ducked low, sliding beneath the attack. Zaltor's force wave hit nothing but air. David sprang up and punched Zaltor in the chest. The crowd erupted. Zaltor stumbled backward, eyes wide in shock. No one had ever landed a hit on him before. David smirked. Still think it's luck. A new threat. Before Zaltor could respond, a loud alarm blared through the academy. Professor Geralt's expression darkened. He turned to the control panel. The screen flashed with a warning message. Emergency alert. Unknown enemy approaching the academy. All students to battle stations. David's heart pounded. This fight was over. A new battle was about to begin. And this time, it wasn't a training exercise. The academy's emergency alarms blared through the halls, their sharp sound echoing in every direction. The students who had just been watching the duel between David and Zaltor now turned toward the large holoscreen above the arena. A red warning flashed. Unknown enemy approaching. All students to battle stations. David's heart pounded. This was no training exercise. Professor Geralt stepped forward, his face serious. Attention, students. A hostile force is approaching the academy. This is a real battle. Get to your assigned squads immediately. The students rushed toward the exits, their excitement from the duel forgotten. Zaltor shot David a glare. This isn't over, he muttered before turning away. David barely heard him. His mind was racing. A real enemy. A real battle. He had barely survived against training drones. What chance did he have against a real attack? Pip, his small robotic assistant, floated beside him. David, your squad is in Sector 4. You need to move now. David clenched his fists. No time to think. He ran. The enemy arrives. Outside, in the dark sky above the academy, massive warships appeared. Their black metal hulls shimmered against the stars, and their engines hummed with power. David had seen many different alien ships before, but these looked different, sleek, deadly, and built for war. Then the attack began. Bright energy blasts rained down, shaking the academy grounds. The force fields flickered as they struggled to hold. The academy's defense turrets activated, firing back at the enemy ships. David and the other students ran toward the battle stations. He saw Zaltor, Zerka, and the strongest students taking command of their squads. They looked confident, ready for war. David, however, felt a cold fear in his chest. He wasn't ready. He wasn't strong like them. David. Pip beeped urgently. You have to get to your squad's position. David snapped out of his thoughts and ran toward Sector 4, where a group of students were setting up defenses. He grabbed a blaster rifle from the armory, his hands shaking slightly. This was real, and there was no turning back. Thrown into the fight, the first wave of enemy attack drones descended from the sky, their red eyes glowing menacingly. They moved fast, firing energy blasts as they swarmed toward the academy. The students opened fire. The battlefield turned into chaos. Blaster shots, explosions, and the sound of metal crashing against metal. David aimed his rifle at a drone and fired. Missed. He tried again. The shot barely scratched its armor. "Focus, David," Pip shouted. David took a deep breath. He remembered how he survived the survival trial, not by fighting like the others, but by adapting. The drones had a pattern. Their movements were fast, but predictable. David watched carefully, waiting for the right moment. Then, he fired. The shot hit perfectly, striking the drone's weak spot. It exploded, crashing to the ground. David's eyes widened. He had done it. He turned and fired again, this time hitting another drone. Then another. His aim was improving fast. The other students noticed. "He's actually keeping up," one muttered. "Wasn't he the weakest?" another asked. David didn't have time to care. He was too focused on surviving. But the battle was far from over. A new threat. From above, a massive shadow loomed over the battlefield. The students stopped firing and looked up in shock. A large black war mech descended from the enemy ship. It was 3 times the size of any student, its body covered in heavy armor. Its red eyes glowed, and its hands crackled with energy weapons. Professor Geralt's voice came through the comms. "Warning, a Titan-class mech has entered the battlefield. All squads, focus fire on it now." Zaltor and Zerka rushed toward the mech, leading the attack. Zaltor used his telekinesis to throw debris at it, while Zerka fired precision shots at its joints. The mech barely flinched. It raised its arm, energy cannons charging. Then it fired. A massive explosion erupted, sending students flying backward. The force knocked David off his feet, his rifle skidding across the ground. His ears rang as he struggled to get up. The mech advanced, stepping over the wreckage like it was nothing. David's breath caught. None of their attacks were working. Nothing was stopping it. For the first time since the battle started, a terrifying thought entered his mind. "We can't win." The moment of choice, David looked around. The strongest students were still fighting, but even they couldn't stop the mech. The academy's defenses were failing. David had 2 choices: stay down and let the real warriors handle it. Do something crazy. He clenched his fists. He wasn't the strongest. He wasn't the smartest. But he had survived before because he had something different: his ability to adapt. David's eyes darted across the battlefield, analyzing the mech. Then he saw it, a weak point, a small section of exposed wiring near its lower back. A crazy plan formed in his mind. He grabbed his rifle, took a deep breath, and ran straight at the mech. The students gasped. What is he doing? The mech turned its red eyes toward him, its energy cannon charge, ready to fire. David didn't stop. He had no powers, no special abilities. But he didn't need them. He just needed one perfect shot. David ran straight toward the Titan-class mech, his heart pounding like a drum. Every logical part of his brain screamed at him to stop, to run away. But he ignored it. The mech's red eyes locked onto him, its energy cannon charge glowing brighter by the second. One hit from that, and he was done. But David wasn't planning to get hit. The gamble. From the side, Zaltor's eyes widened. He's insane. Zerka was just as shocked. What is he thinking? But David wasn't thinking. He was acting. His eyes were fixed on the small, exposed wiring at the mech's lower back, the only weak spot he had found. If he could hit it, maybe he could disable the mech. Maybe. David gripped his rifle tightly. No mistakes. No second chances. The mech fired. A massive energy blast shot toward him. David jumped. The explosion erupted behind him, heat searing his back. But he was still moving. Closer, closer. The mech raised its arm, swinging at him. David ducked, the metal fist barely missing him. He slid across the ground, stopping just beneath the massive machine. Now or never. He aimed his rifle directly at the exposed wiring. Breathe. Focus. Fire. He pulled the trigger. A single energy bolt shot forward, straight into the mech's weak spot. For a second, nothing happened. Then, the mech shuddered. Sparks flew from its back. The red glow in its eyes flickered. It tried to move, but its joints locked up. David rolled away just as the massive machine collapsed to the ground with a loud crash. The battlefield fell silent. The impossible victory. The students stared in shock. The Titan-class mech, something that should have been unstoppable, was now nothing more than a pile of smoking metal. And David, the so-called weakest student, had taken it down alone. Zerka was the first to react. Did he just? Zaltor clenched his fists, his usual confidence shaken. That was. He stopped himself, not knowing what to say. Professor Geralt's voice came through the comms, filled with awe. Target neutralized. All squads, regroup and prepare for the next wave. A cheer erupted from the students. They had just won a battle they were sure they would lose, and it was because of David. The aftermath. As the students gathered, David sat on a piece of fallen debris, exhausted. His hands were shaking, his whole body aching. Pip floated beside him. David, that was incredible. You calculated the exact weak spot and took it down in one shot. David gave a tired smile. Yeah, I guess I did. Zerka approached, crossing her arms. All right, I'll admit it. That was impressive. David raised an eyebrow. Was that a compliment? She rolled her eyes. Don't get used to it. Then, surprisingly, Zaltor stepped forward. He looked at David for a long moment before giving a single nod. You fought well, he said, his tone more serious than usual. David blinked. Coming from Zaltor, that was almost like saying, you're worthy. Before David could reply, the Academy's main holoscreen flickered on. A new message appeared. Warning. Enemy mothership DTCTE. Full-scale invasion incoming. The cheering stopped. The real fight was just beginning. A new challenge. Professor Geralt's voice came through the Academy speakers. All students, report to the war room immediately. This battle isn't over. David pushed himself up, still feeling sore. He had survived against one mech, but an entire mothership. He didn't know if he was ready. But something inside him whispered, you've adapted before. You'll do it again. Taking a deep breath, David followed the others toward the war room, stepping into the next chapter of the war. David followed the crowd of students into the war room, his mind racing. He had just destroyed a Titan-class mech, but now a mothership was coming. How could they possibly fight that? Inside the war room, holographic maps floated in the air, showing the battlefield outside. Professor Geralt stood in the center, his expression grim. All of you listen carefully, the professor said. The enemy's mothership is approaching. If we don't stop it, the Academy will be destroyed. A tense silence filled the room. Zaltor stepped forward, his arms crossed. What are our options? Professor Geralt pointed to the hologram. We have 3 choices. Defend the Academy and hope our shields hold. Evacuate, but we don't have enough ships for everyone. Launch a counterattack and take down the mothership before it reaches us. David frowned. None of these options sounded good. Zerka shook her head. The first 2 plans are too risky. We can't run, and we can't just sit here and wait to be destroyed. Zaltor nodded. Then we attack. Some students hesitated. How? One asked. That thing is massive. We don't have the firepower to destroy it. David studied the hologram. The mothership was huge, covered in thick armor. Impossible to break through. Unless. His eyes narrowed as he spotted something. What's this? He asked, pointing at a section near the back of the ship. Professor Geralt glanced at it. That's the engine core. If we can destroy it, the whole ship will lose power. David's mind worked quickly. Then that's our target. The room fell silent. One of the students scoffed. Are you crazy? That would mean sneaking onto the enemy mothership. David didn't back down. It's the only way. If we attack from the outside, we'll fail. But if we get inside and destroy the core, we have a chance. Zaltor smirked. You have a habit of doing impossible things. Zerka sighed. I hate to say this, but he's right. Professor Gerrel nodded. All right, we'll form a strike team to infiltrate the mothership. David took a deep breath. This was it, the real test. Preparing for the mission, the students rushed to the hangar. Small stealth ships lined the walls, designed for secret missions. David climbed into one, his hands shaking slightly. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a warrior. But he was here, and there was no turning back. Pip floated beside him. David, are you sure about this? David tightened his grip on the controls. Not really. Pip beeped. Great, that makes 2 of us. The launch countdown began. 3, 2, 1. The ship shot out into space, heading straight for the enemy mothership. David felt the weight of space around him. Stars stretched endlessly in every direction, and ahead, the giant enemy ship loomed like a floating fortress. Their plan was simple. Get in, destroy the engine core, get out. If they failed, they wouldn't be coming back. Breaking in. As they neared the mothership, its defenses activated. Laser turrets locked onto them, firing rapidly. David's ship swerved, dodging the blasts. We can't get close like this. Zerka shouted over the comms. David gritted his teeth. Think. Adapt. Then he saw it, a supply bay opening at the side of the mothership. That's our way in, he called. The team followed him, weaving through enemy fire. One by one, their ships slipped through the supply bay, just as the doors closed behind them. They had made it inside, but now the real danger began. Inside the mothership, the strike team moved quickly, blasters ready. The hallways were dark, lit only by the eerie glow of alien symbols on the walls. Pip scanned ahead. The engine core is 5 levels down. Zaltor cracked his knuckles. Then let's move. They hurried forward, but soon footsteps echoed down the hall. Enemy guards, Zerka hissed. David pressed against the wall as the alien soldiers marched past, their armor gleaming under the dim lights. One of them stopped. David's breath caught. The alien turned its head slightly, then kept walking. David let out a quiet sigh of relief. That was too close. They moved deeper into the ship, avoiding patrols and security drones. Every step they took brought them closer to their goal. But then, an alarm blared through the ship. They had been spotted. David turned to the others. Run. The mission had just become a race against time. The alarm blared, filling the hallways with red flashing lights. The enemy knew they were here. Time was running out. David's heart pounded as he and the team sprinted through the metal corridors of the enemy mothership. The plan had been to sneak in quietly, but now it had turned into a full-speed escape mission. The engine core is still 4 levels down. Pip beeped urgently, floating beside David. We need to move faster, Zerka shouted. Behind them, alien soldiers poured into the hallway, their weapons charged and ready. The air sizzled as energy blasts zipped past the team, hitting the walls and floor. David didn't stop running. Go left, he yelled, spotting a maintenance shaft. Zaltor kicked the metal grate off, and one by one, the team jumped inside. Through the vents, the metal tunnels were tight and hot, filled with the low hum of the ship's systems. Crawling through was difficult, especially for Zaltor, who was twice the size of everyone else. This is ridiculous, he grumbled. I am not built for this. David ignored him. Pip, where does this lead? Pip scanned the tunnel. There's a drop ahead. If we slide down, we'll reach the 3rd level. That puts us 1 step closer to the core. David nodded. Then let's do it. One by one, they slid down the metal slope, landing in a dark storage bay below. David helped Zerka up. Everyone okay? Before anyone could answer, the doors burst open. The enemy had found them. Trapped, alien soldiers stormed into the storage bay, their weapons raised. David and the others froze. There were too many. No way to fight them all. One of the aliens, a tall commander with glowing red eyes, stepped forward. His voice was deep and mechanical. "Surrender. You are trapped." David's mind raced. Surrender, not an option. Fighting, impossible. They needed a distraction. His eyes flickered to the fuel tanks stacked in the corner of the room. That could work. He looked at Zerka and Zaltor, silently signaling with his eyes. "Get ready." The commander stepped closer. "Put down your weapons." David took a deep breath. Then, he fired at the fuel tanks. Boom! The explosion rocked the room, sending flames and smoke everywhere. The alien soldiers were blinded for a moment. "Go. Now," David shouted. They rushed through the chaos, pushing past disoriented enemies and escaping through another doorway. The plan had worked. But they weren't safe yet. The engine core. After more running, dodging, and barely escaping enemy squads, they finally reached their target. The engine core was massive, a glowing sphere of pure energy surrounded by thick metal supports. David's breath caught. This was it. Zerka quickly examined the control panel. "We need to overload the core. If we can make it unstable, the whole ship will shut down." Zaltor cracked his knuckles. "Tell me what to smash." David grinned. "Let's not smash yet. Pip, how do we do this?" Pip floated to the control panel, scanning it. "If we redirect power to one section, it will create a chain reaction and explode." David nodded. "Then let's make this ship go boom." Final countdown. Zerka typed quickly on the control panel. "I set the overload sequence. We have 5 minutes before this place goes up." David turned to run, but the doors slammed shut. A voice echoed through the room. "You will not leave alive." The alien commander stood at the entrance, blocking their only exit. Behind him, more soldiers appeared. David clenched his fists. They were so close, but now they were trapped. The ship was going to explode in 5 minutes, and they had to fight their way out. The countdown had begun, 5 minutes until the mothership exploded. David's breath was heavy as he stared at the alien commander standing at the exit. Behind the commander, more soldiers filled the room, their weapons glowing with charged energy. They were trapped. Zerka gritted her teeth. "David, what's the plan?" David clenched his fists. There was no time to think. "We fight. We get out. We survive." The alien commander raised his arm, signaling his soldiers to attack. The battle had begun. A desperate battle. The first energy blasts shot through the air. David ducked, rolling behind a metal console. A bolt barely missed his head, scorching the floor. Zaltor let out a roar and charged straight into the enemy. His massive fists sent 2 aliens flying across the room. "Come on, fight me." Zerka moved fast, using her blaster with deadly accuracy. Every shot she fired hit its mark, taking down enemy after enemy. David aimed and fired at the lights above, shattering them. Sparks flew, and the room dimmed, making it harder for the aliens to see. "Good idea." Pip peeped. "Now they can't aim properly." David didn't stop. He ran low, weaving between cover, taking quick shots where he could. His heart pounded. Every second counted. The commander's power. The alien commander stepped forward, unfazed by the chaos. His armor glowed, and with a sweep of his hand, he sent a wave of energy crashing into David. David was thrown back, hitting the wall hard. Pain shot through his body. His vision blurred. The commander loomed over him. "You should have surrendered, human." David coughed, gripping his blaster. "Yeah, well, I don't quit." The commander raised his arm, ready to strike again. But before he cooled, Zaltor tackled him. The 2 giants crashed into the floor, locked in battle. David forced himself to stand. There was no time to rest. The countdown was still going. 2 minutes left. Reaching the exit. We need to get out of here now, Zerka yelled. David saw the exit door, still blocked by enemy soldiers. His mind raced. There had to be a way. Then, he saw the control panel beside the door. If he could reroute power, maybe he could open it. "Cover me," he shouted. Zerka and Pip provided cover fire, keeping the enemy distracted as David sprinted to the panel. His hands flew across the controls, overriding the security system. Come on, come on." The door hissed and slid open. Yes. David turned to see Zaltor punching the alien commander with full force, sending him crashing into the wall. "Let's go," Zaltor growled. The team rushed through the door, running as fast as they could. 1 minute left. Escape to space. The hallways shook as explosions rippled through the mothership. Fire and smoke filled the corridors. David's lungs burned, but he didn't stop. The hangar was just ahead. Their ships were waiting. But before they could reach them, a massive explosion ripped through the floor, sending David flying. He crashed onto the cold metal, pain shooting through his body. Zerka and Zaltor stumbled, but kept moving. Pip hovered over David. Get up. Get up. We have 10 seconds. David pushed himself up, his legs shaking. No time for pain. The team dashed into their ships. David barely made it into his cockpit before the countdown hit 0. The explosion. The mothership erupted in a massive fireball, tearing apart in space. David's ship spun wildly as the shockwave hit, alarms blaring. "Hold on," Pip screamed. David gritted his teeth, gripping the controls tightly. He fought to regain control as debris flew past him. Then, silence. The explosion settled. The mothership was gone. They had won. David let out a long breath, his hands still shaking. "We made it." Zerka's voice crackled over the comms. "I can't believe it. We actually did it." Zaltor laughed. "That was a good fight." David looked back at the wreckage floating in space. It wasn't just a good fight. It was proof. Proof that humans could do the impossible. But this war wasn't over yet. And David had a feeling. This was just the beginning. The battlefield was now empty space, filled with debris from the destroyed mothership. Small fires burned in the wreckage, flickering like dying stars. David sat in his cockpit, his hands still gripping the controls. His heart pounded in his chest. They had won. But the reality of what had just happened hadn't fully settled in. Pip beaked beside him. "David, are you alive? You haven't said anything in 30 seconds. David blinked, shaking off the shock. "Yeah, I'm here." Zerka's voice crackled over the comms. "We actually did it. The mothership is gone." Zaltor laughed. "I told you humans were full of surprises." David finally let himself breathe. They had risked everything and survived. But now they had to go home. The return to the academy. As they flew back to the academy, David watched the stars blur past. He thought about everything that had happened. The training, the failures, the humiliation of being the worst student in class. And now, he had led a mission that saved them all. The academy's docking bay came into view. Ships swarmed around them, guiding them in. As they landed, the hangar was already crowded with students, teachers, and officers waiting. The moment David and his team stepped out of their ships, cheers erupted. People shouted their names. Some students clapped. Others gasped in disbelief. David stood there, stunned. Just days ago, these same students had called him a failure. Now they looked at him like he was a legend. Professor Garrel pushed through the crowd, his usual stern face now filled with pride. "You did it," he said. "You destroyed the mothership." David gave a small nod. "It wasn't just me. It was all of us." Zaltor clapped a heavy hand on David's shoulder. "But you were the one who made it possible." Zerka crossed her arms, smirking. Not bad for the worst student in class. Ha! David chuckled. Guess not. Recognition and respect. Later that evening, the Academy held a ceremony in the Great Hall. The highest-ranking officers, professors, and students gathered to honor the team's bravery. Professor Gerrel stood before them. Tonight, we recognize those who showed true courage in the face of impossible odds. He turned to David. David, you proved something today. That intelligence and skill are important, but what truly matters is heart, determination, and the will to never give up. The crowd murmured in agreement. Gerrel continued, For your bravery, we grant you the Medal of Valor, the highest honor given to a cadet. The hall erupted into applause as Gerrel pinned the medal onto David's uniform. For the first time, David felt like he truly belonged. No one looked down on him anymore. He was no longer just a struggling human student. He was a hero. A new future. After the ceremony, David and his team sat on the Academy's rooftop, looking out at the stars. Pip floated beside him. So, what now? David took a deep breath. This was just the beginning. Zoltor nodded. The enemy won't stop after one loss. They'll be back. Zerka smirked. Good. Let them come. We'll be ready. David looked up at the vast universe. The Academy had once felt like his whole world, but now he realized there was so much more out there. And he was ready for whatever came next, because he was David, the human who had been underestimated. And he had proved to the galaxy that humans were stronger than anyone had ever imagined. The end.